Hello and welcome. I'm Barkha. You're watching the Mojo Story. Our big focus today is on COVID. There appears to be finally a therapeutic breakthrough that could change how the entire world is responding to COVID. Let's bring up our big story on the program today. Merck is talking about early success with a new COVID pill. In fact, the phase 3 trials for this drug are not yet complete, but given the early successful responses, this could finally be a game changer. Remember, so far there has been no treatment for COVID, and in fact, vaccines have been seen to be the most effective measure. But now, this particular pill, according to studies so far, halves the risk of hospitalization and deaths by 50%. Five Indian companies also have stakes in what could happen next. They have been deployed to manufacture this pill that is still awaiting final clearances. Of course, questions remain about how early a global supply chain can be addressed, even if this is the wonder drug that everybody has been waiting for. But is it really? That is the big question on this special broadcast today. We'll be asking experts to explain what we know and don't know, what works and doesn't work thus far about what's being called the new magic COVID pill. Is it really that? Let's bring up our experts on the program today. From Atlanta, joining us today is Dr. Saju Mathew, who's a public health specialist based out of the United States of America. We're also joined by Dr. Vinita Bal, one of the country's foremost immunologists and scientists, and Dr. Rajesh Parekh, who's, of course, with the Jaslok Hospital, but also an author of one of the earliest research-oriented books on COVID, is with us as well. Dr. Mathew, if I may start with you, I know there's a great deal of excitement with, with Merck's early success with this. Can you tell us what we know thus far? What's the good news and what we still don't know?
Yeah, Namaskar, Barkha. So excited to be on your show. I really am excited as a primary care physician for a number of reasons. Just like you mentioned in the open, currently, we just have the antibody infusion for sick patients in the hospital. But in order to get the antibody infusion, you have to go to the hospital. You have to get an IV and you have to get an injection. Can you imagine if people can recover at home with an oral pill that Merck is manufacturing? You take one pill twice a day. It cuts down the severity of hospitalization and deaths by 50%. That's pretty incredible. This is only to be given to people who have been diagnosed with COVID early in the disease. They can recover at home. Now, I definitely want to make it clear, Barkha, that this is not a replacement for a vaccine. A vaccine prevents COVID. This pill treats COVID, but still, can you imagine how this could be used in countries where the vaccine access is poor? So overall, I'm excited. We still should be looking at the data. This was a press release by Merck, but the FDA will be looking at it pretty soon. So overall, really excited.
And I think the really important point you make, Dr. Mathew, is that it is not a replacement for vaccines. Prevention is always better than cure. That's the old childhood cliche, which is probably the truest thing about medicine. But can you tell us whether 50% is a good response? Because there are those who would look at vaccines and say that the efficacy of the vaccines is much greater. So of course, prevention is greater, but even the vaccines' efficacy as a percentage is greater. Is 50% halving the risk of hospitalization and death really a good response, according to you?
You know, if you compare the treatments that we have right now, pretty much everything that we have in the hospital is experimental. The antibody infusion is giving patients the antibodies that people have recovered from, infusing that into the body, and that definitely gives you a jump start. But if you look at the way this drug was created, it was specifically to attack the replication of the virus. You see, COVID is so infectious. Once it gets into the mouth and down the throat, it begins to replicate. So the reason that I'm excited is, yes, 50% doesn't sound that great, but if you look at the placebo versus people who actually got the treatment, in the people that actually got the treatment, there were 0 deaths. So overall, yes, I mean, 50% for a lot of people that are not in the science field may not sound tremendous, but remember, it is an oral drug. You're not going into the hospital, and it could be cheaply manufactured. So I still think that this could be a game changer. We still have to be able to look at the data. That's what I keep saying, because so far only Merck has looked at the data. FDA will be looking at it pretty soon.
Vinita, do you share Dr. Matthews' optimism? And I think he's, of course, placed the caveats. We need data that can be examined by neutral bodies, by third parties. But do you share the optimism thus far, especially when we consider that there are, I think 55 countries where less than 10% of the population is still fully vaccinated. Global vaccine inequity is a huge challenge. Dr. Matthews' country, the United States of America, has the privilege of not getting jabbed even where vaccines are in surplus. Is this the pill the world needs? Can we unmute, ma'am, please? Dr. Vinita, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry. As an academic, of course, the results are exciting without seeing them. In the sense, as Dr. Matthews said, this is still a press release. We haven't looked at the data. But there is something on the horizon. But what worries me is that first thing, it is 50% effective. It is also the case that 50% better or whatever, 200% better, and whichever way one wants to look at it as compared to controls. So there is a significant proportion of people who will not get benefited. Whether those are the latecomers in the sense post-diagnosis, how much is the gap between in entry of the virus and the initiation of the treatment, these issues are not just academic interest. In fact, they are of interest and significance to the practicing doctors, and the other two people on the panel are actual practicing doctors. But what I'm also worried about is that in a country like India, even antibodies are not easily available. Dr. Matthew talked about it. I'm sure they are so regularly available. They are very, very expensive. Of course, hospitalization, intravenous injection, all of these are issues. But even Merck's pill is under patent regime currently. And Merck is making really nice noises, saying that we will try to license it to multiple entities in multiple countries, but we know that
including 5 in India.
I understand, but the trickle down effect, even in the economic terms, we know, and the trickle down effect, even when there is a patent which is to be not broken, but if there is multiple companies from India are going to manufacture, even there my worries are very much there. So that's why I made a distinction between my interest and enthusiasm as an academic and my apprehension from the public health perspective.
So let me ask you this before I go to Dr. Parekh. Your anxiety appears to be about supply, not the science of the pill per se. Let's come to the supply separately. What about the science of the pill? Can you explain in simple terms to non-medical people like me, how does this work? Dr. Matthew gave us a hint that it does it by replicating the virus. How does this actually work? We finally have a therapeutic response to COVID. That's a big thing.
In principle, I know how it works. We, of course, haven't looked at the patient data, clinical trial data. But what it does is closer to remdesivir, but this is much better. But it is approximately the same line of action in the sense there is a polymerase which the virus uses for its replication inside the body. So this polymerase, which is virus specific, and it is not seen in human beings, and that's the interesting part of it. So that polymerase is getting affected adversely by this drug, and because of which replication will be inhibited. And that's precisely the critical point. That's why I said if this drug can be given very early on when virus is actually replicating, and that is the major concern, because eventually immune response will come up and control the viral replication independent of the drug. But if this drug can be given very early on in a very early window, same logic as for remdesivir, if it can be given very early on, then viral replication will be inhibited, at least decreased. So viral load in the body will be decreased, and hence, as immune system kicks in, it will be able to handle the situation much better. But this early phase is very important. And when we were using remdesivir, left, right, and central in the center in the second wave, it was very late. And at that phase, I suspect even this drug will be completely useless, or pretty much useless, I should say.
Okay, so this is very interesting, and it is actually Rajesh Parikh's favorite subject. At the height of the pandemic, when you actually had, doctors themselves from small private hospitals in India. Dr. Matthew, you may not know this, so it's interesting for you to know this. We actually had small private hospitals sending their staff to stand in long lines to buy remdesivir, over which science was divided as to whether it worked at all. Rajesh Parikh was among those that said this is a waste of time. So now my question to you is this, Dr. Parikh: if this is based on the same principles of remdesivir and it needs really early intervention to have any efficacy, does it, I don't want to be a dampener, but does it still give you excitement and optimism? You're on mute, sir. Now you're on.
Yes, Barkha, always a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for recollecting my tremendous apprehension about what was happening with remdesivir, particularly in our country. I am in virtual agreement, if you'll pardon the pun, with my co-panelists in both their excitement and concern about this drug. I think Dr. Matthew perhaps has particular reason to be excited. The research has happened in Emory University in his hometown. And yes, it is promising, it is exciting, and an independent body has looked into it. So I'm not going to repeat what my colleagues have said, just add on to a few things. An independent body has looked at the data, as has been appropriately pointed out. It's not published, it's not been peer reviewed, and it's not been around long enough for us to look at certain midterm onset or even late onset side effects. But whatever we've seen, the side effects are actually less than those of placebo. So all of that is exciting in terms of the principle. And yes, the word "veer" at the end of it is just indicative of that it works like any other antiviral agent in stopping the replication. The difference, however, between remdesivir and this, and which is why our enthusiasm needn't be that dampened, we could have cautious optimism, is that it is demonstrated to work in patients who have mild to moderate disease. The hospitalization rate differences between the placebo and the study group are impressive, as are the death rate. So there are many reasons to feel excited about it. About the supply chain, and that's an interesting point. Merck has planned on manufacturing 10 million doses by the end of the year. And of course, 3 to 4 times that much in the coming year. They're betting on it. That kind of, makes me feel a little more optimistic about it.
I have to understand, given how skeptical you were about remdesivir, why is this different?
The difference is in the data. The difference in the way the data has been collected. Remdesivir was a repurposed drug. It was a drug which was, initially researched for Ebola and various other things. And even there were concerns. And it was repurposed. And the data was just not there. It wasn't as impressive as this drug. But on the other hand, there's also reason to be cautious, because I think it's a bit premature to get terribly excited about this. This pandemic has been full of many drugs which have come in the guise and the avatar of panaceas and then have turned out to be damn squids. So absolutely, I'm with you in, you're being an ethical chronicler, if I may say so, of what is happening, to be cautious, to be concerned. But there is a difference. And the difference is what we are seeing in a research study and looked at by an independent body. So it's not the pharmaceutical which has looked at it, that they are showing there's a difference. But there is another thing which I am quite pleased about, and that is in the pricing policy. So ordinarily it would cost $700 for the course. But what Merck has promised, that based on the World Bank's economic index of countries, the pricing is going to be different in different countries, so that it is affordable and accessible to all. Now, this is dramatically different to what happened in the early days of the AIDS pandemic,
yes,
where people were making enormous and unreasonable profits from the drug. Also, if you're looking at 50,000 rupees as treatment, and as the treatment over here, and weigh that against the costs of hospitalization and other costs, even at that price, I don't think it's very high. But I'm glad that they're going to reduce it in a country like ours.
And I am reminded of the fact that poor families at the height of the second wave were spending 50,000 rupees on a single injection of medicines that were absolutely dodgy and dubious, as it turns out. Dr. Matthew, if I can, take this to you. In India, we've had our own journey, first with hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, Flaviflu. I'm telling you, medicines that were given to me for COVID that we know were absolutely like dud medicines. Merck had to issue a statement, I think, saying ivermectin no good, and people still kept administering it. It was a completely bizarre situation. But I have a different question. Last year, we were told that there was great hope from monoclonal antibodies if given at an early stage in treatment. What is the difference? What happened to that? What happened? We don't hear about monoclonal antibodies anymore. They were also called a kind of miracle therapeutic intervention.
Barka, monoclonal antibody infusion, believe it or not, is really the only therapy in so many ways that is working currently. I mean, you give patients the steroid called dexamethasone in patients that are admitted. That has shown some promise. Remdesivir has been okay, has not really been the wonder drug, at least here in the US. It does reduce ICU admission, but monoclonal antibody infusion, we've known how efficacious antibodies is. Basically, it's really simple. The patient falls sick, and before the patient has time to develop their own antibodies, we are infusing a whole barrage of, if you will, soldiers to fight the virus. So at least in the US, just like Dr. Bal had mentioned, it is expensive. I mean, it's a very expensive treatment. But in the US, now as a primary care physician, when
how does it compare?
Sick,
how does it compare? Sorry, I'm interrupting you. I just want to understand, because it's the only other therapeutic response we have. How does the monoclonal antibody compare with what Merck is planning to bring into the market with this particular molnupiravir?
Right. So antibodies is basically, like I mentioned, you're giving the body a chance to fight. It's a fresh soldier or army of soldiers. When it comes to the antiviral drug that Merck is touting, that specifically attacks viral replication. So actually what I see end up happening is this combination of therapy could be used together in a sick patient. So if a 70-year-old patient comes in with diabetes, heart disease, we could actually give them the antibody infusion and the oral therapy together. Also in America, we're talking about how we can give the monoclonal antibody infusion as an injection in the office. So we're trying different modalities. The treatment is actually different. The way these two drugs work, Barka, is different. So I look at it in the future as a possible combination therapy and also individual therapy for patients who are not that sick that are recovering at home with the oral Merck drug.
Dr. Vinita Bal, do you want to weigh in on that? The differences in the two. Cost is one of them, but other than the cost, I know that the monoclonal antibodies are very expensive. I also remember Roche had actually gifted some to India, but in India, we just don't hear of it anymore. And that's why I asked Dr. Matthew that question.
Yes, the ideal way was not just one monoclonal, but a combination of monoclonals was supposed to be the best option, because monoclonal antibodies by themselves can become infructuous if there is no interaction possible, what one equivalent to a drug resistance. I won't go into the details, but that's why more than one cocktail is normally recommended. Major difference is that the drug is acting for the duration that it is inside the body, which is 4 or 5. So it's a 12-hour. You have to give the drug twice a day for 5 days. That's the recommended one that I read about. And what happens is antibodies are proteins. They will sit in your body or circulate in your body for about 12 days, if not more. So one dose of this cocktail given will be, so those antibodies will be available, and they are theoretically supposed to bind to the virus as virus is circulating, and hence sort of helping in the clearance of the virus. So one is sort of, drug, both are drugs, but their efficacies and their way of functioning is very different. And in that sense, I do agree that if there are trials which say eventually that if you give the antibodies as well as the drug, is that going to be more helpful? It remains a question mark, but it also worries me to some extent, because if the antibodies are again infused very, very early on and the virus is very, very rapidly cleared, then there is less of a viral load in the body for its own immune system to get robustly triggered. So this is a balancing act which needs to be handled. I know clinicians have been handling it carefully, and the trials have also shown this. But as an immunologist, I keep wondering whether the presence of tons of antibodies at some point given after intravenous injection is going to backfire to some extent, so that the patient's own immune system does not kick in very efficiently, and hence does not give very long-term protection, which it should be after the infection. So that's my worry, and those are the differences in a sense that I would highlight.
Dr. Rajesh Parekh, do we know, and I'm sorry if I'm asking somewhat very basic questions, but I think those are the basic questions that would strike our audience, which is not trained like all of you experts. Do we know if this new COVID pill is variant agnostic?
Actually, what they did are genomic studies on the patients who benefited from the pill. Actually, in all, but what they found that in the ones that benefited, it cut across all the genomic variants, the alpha, the delta. But again, these are very, very small studies, genomic studies that were done. But Barkha, if I may add, on the comparison between the monoclonal antibodies and the current medication, and just adding on to what my colleagues have said, I've watched the development of monoclonal antibodies with tremendous interest over the last 40 years. When I was at Johns Hopkins, I was actually deputed to go to NIH to attend a very preliminary meeting on the development of monoclonal antibodies and report to my department what was happening. And the interesting thing about monoclonal antibodies is they are like targeted missiles. They are missiles which go specifically and neutralize the virus. And over the last 35 years, it's been a very exciting journey, culminating in the award, the Nobel Prize awards. Of course, these are monoclonal antibodies used specifically in cancer treatment. And, 2 years ago, the Nobel Prize was awarded. And I've also witnessed the use of monoclonal antibodies in patients. And so undoubtedly, they're superior to the current medication. However, what happens, and they've been around for a long time, but they're phenomenally expensive. I mean, there's no comparison in the costing. And then again, as has been pointed out, it has to be a continuous infusion into the body. It's delivered with a small pump which calibrates it and gives it at a certain rate, but clearly not easy to administer as opposed to the pill. So if you look at the cost effectiveness, then I think the balance clearly tilts in favor of an oral pill as opposed to a medication which is given by...
So it's a difference of cost, not a difference of efficacy for you. You actually think the antibodies are...
I think to the best of my knowledge, the data is clear that monoclonal antibodies are here to stay. So they're not being talked about, as you mentioned in the beginning. That's because of the cost factor, and they're not being affordable. But they're still the best known treatment that we have. And eventually, all the new treatments will have to be weighed against that gold standard in terms of efficacy, though we cannot ignore the cost factor.
Very interesting. I have time for just a bunch of quick last comments. Vinita, I'll start with you. If we are talking about cost meets efficacy in this new pill, by when do you think this can start making a difference? 10 million doses is pretty much nothing.
Absolutely. And I don't see, I know in the upper middle class patients in India, this antibody therapy is probably gaining grounds slowly and steadily, because I've been hearing that doctors are giving some cocktails, and I presume those are the antibodies that are being given. So and 50,000, as we said, when there is desperation, people do try to raise that money, but 50,000 is beyond majority of the population's affordability. So reach, affordability, everything. So even when Merck is promising that the costs will be lower in India, if I'm looking at it from India-centric view, I am still quite wary that this is not going to reach us in the near future. And to that, I tend to add, and I hope I'm wrong in that I mean, we are probably not going to get another serious mutation in the virus, and hopefully we are not going to get another huge wave. If that is the case, then the way we are chugging along with vaccination and with already people who have infected and recovered, this therapy, even if we don't see it as becoming available in India, we are not probably going to be feeling very sorry for ourselves. This is phenomenal
Let's hope.
optimism. This is
Let's
phenomenal optimism, but this is how
Yeah. I think we're also burnt by the second wave, that we're scared to trust our phenomenal optimism. Dr. Parekh, a quick last word to you, and I'll ask Dr. Matthew to close for us. Do you share Vinita's, sort of phenomenal optimism that even if we don't get the supply of this COVID pill, it's okay, we can manage?
Well, I'll tell you what I see happening, and I have a feeling I'm going to be right. We are great in replicating, not just viral replication, but also in generic replication. And before you know it, Barkha, with all the companies whose names you mentioned, I have a strong feeling we're going to be supplying this medication, if indeed it holds up its promise to the rest of the world. I'd just like to end with one fun fact. This name is such a tongue twister, and frankly,
Yes,
I must confess,
Molnupiravir. Yeah, I'm like struggling to remember it.
Yeah, and Barkha, knowing what a stickler you are for details, I actually rehearsed, pronouncing this word, and I tried to figure out where it came from. And here's the fun fact: it comes actually from the Avengers. In the Avengers series, Thor has this hammer with which he just can kill anything and anybody. And that is an even more unpronounceable word, Mjolnir or something like that, which really sends your tongue into a spasm. And Dean Lee, the guy who kind of headed the research at Emory, is probably an Avengers fan, as is Swapi, our son, who drove me nuts by putting Avengers and Star Wars references in our first book, which you reviewed very generously. But,
Yes.
Here is another guy who's an Avengers fan, and I don't know whether this is hype, but he looks upon it as the hammer of Thor, which is, going to wipe out the virus. Let's hope it works.
Your son, Dr. Swapnil Parekh, tweeted warning that the millennials are now going to take over medicine, move over old people. I think that was for all of us. Dr. Matthew, last word to you. Yeah, it is a tongue twister of a name, Molnupiravir. Thor's hammer is what Rajesh has just explained to us. But in terms of how soon can the world have this medicine, what's left to happen?
Well, I'm going to leave on a very optimistic note. And by the way, instead of Molnupiravir, maybe we can call it Molnu, almost like Monu, right? So we can make it sound almost Indian. But I definitely am optimistic that Merck will try its best. I mean, Merck is not necessarily doing that well. I think this is their opportunity to show the world on a huge platform that at the end of the day, Barkha, I always say this, until everybody is safe, nobody is safe. It doesn't matter if America vaccinates the whole country. Until India is safe, we're not all safe together. So I still feel like the most important thing with this pandemic is not only the optimism about this oral drug, but also the fact that we have to mass produce vaccines. That to me has been really the difficulty in the pandemic. It doesn't matter how much vaccines America gives India. At the end of the day, why are we not mass producing vaccines? Because remember, this drug does not substitute for a vaccine. You don't want to get the virus in the first place. I'm also taking care, Barkha, of a lot of people that have long COVID. 30% of people who actually recover from COVID have symptoms of COVID for 3 to 6 months. They're heart racing, brain fog. So people listening to us in India and all over the world, I think we have reason to be optimistic about both the vaccine and the drug. And eventually, I think that we are going to get through this pandemic. I want all of us to feel that sense of hope at a time when so many people are dying. But lastly, Barkha, I have so much respect for you. Thank you for everything you have done. I've been a big fan of yours from Africa and India. Dr. Vinita and Dr. Parekh, thank you so much. Really enjoy meeting both of you as well.
Thank you, Dr. Matthew, for your kind words, and more than the kind words and the generous feedback on our work here. Thank you for leaving us with a note of optimism. God knows it's important in these times which often seem so bleak. Thank you, as always, to all our doctors for everything that you do. Dr. Matthew from Atlanta today, Dr. Parekh, Dr. Bal, pleasure as always. And to our audience, there is hope. There continues to be hope. We tell you when things are dire, but we also tell you when there is reason to hope again. And perhaps, finally, we are at that brink where we can dare to hope again. Thank you very much to our panel and to our audience. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Goodbye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.